Well, everybody got quiet, so I guess it's time to start, huh? In all my preparations to get ready, I forgot the one important thing, which was to charge the battery on the laptop. So hopefully it cooperates. It's still loading. All right, if you have your Bible, I'd like to turn to Romans chapter 3. That's where we're going to be picking up today, Romans chapter 3. Get there. Does anybody remember what we talked about last week? Very good. What was some of the summaries or takeaways from Romans chapter 2? Yes.
Some of the notes that I wrote for chapter 2, I've got 12 through 16 and then 17 through 29. Jew or Gentile, if you know the law or not, you will be judged and condemned. Only doers of the law will be justified. When Gentiles know not the law, but do the right thing, seeking, then it shows that they're trying. And that's verse 14. Seeking is the word I underlined. The
Yeah.
action part of that. Then the notes I have for the 17 through 29. This is me. You're a hypocrite. This is my own interpretation. You're a hypocrite for pointing fingers, and then you're doing the bad thing by not following the law. And when this was done back then, even today, Gentiles blaspheme because the Jews do the bad things and judge others.
Yeah.
God must not be all that great if you have the law and you're not following it.
Certainly giving the Gentiles a reason to blaspheme God, yeah.
Yeah, literally. The one who knows but doesn't follow, the one who is circumcised, the descendant of they put themselves on heirs with those categories, but they don't really follow the law, and they're not truly a Jewish person.
Okay. Very good. Yeah. I think I agree with everything you said there. The big takeaway is who is going to be exempt from judgment? No one, right? Judgment has to apply to everyone, and that was where we started. And again, the point is, it was a little loud to me. Sorry, Mike. Oh no, just trying not to blast everybody out. But one of the takeaways was that everyone's going to be judged, and it didn't really matter if you were a Jew versus a Gentile. The point again was the Jews had the law of Moses and heard the law of Moses, but they weren't actually doing the law of Moses. Compared to the Gentiles that were around that were trying to do, they were trying to be doers of the law, even though they didn't have the law. So they were actively had that seeking heart, and that's what we talked about, the importance of the attitude and the heart that someone had. The Jews kind of thought they were in this special relationship that was blessed, and that they had some special exemption from doing what God wanted just because they were chosen, and that is not the intent. As we pointed out, the message there, be doers of the law, not hearers only. Just because you have the law does not mean that it is enough to be justified. God will justify those who are seeking the glory and honor of God, that's chapter 2, verse 7, and who are practicing God's law, chapter 2, verse 13, and those who are cut in the heart, whose desire is God, 2:29. So again, in this idea about who really was the Jew, what really was circumcision, what did it mean? And it was not just the physical act of having the law or the physical act of being circumcised, but it was what was the condition of the heart? That's really what it got to. Did they have the seeking heart? Did they have a heart that was cut, that was molded in God's manner? Paul taught that being a physical Jew did not justify. Keeping the law of God is what was important to God. And just because the Jews possessed the law and were children of Abraham and were circumcised did not mean that they would be pronounced innocent in judgment. They were still going to be judged. So we ended last week with the big question. So what was the advantage then of being a Jew? If God is impartial and judges justly, then why did God even bother having a special people? Why did God have an Israel? What was the advantage of being a Jew? Why did God have a nation like Israel to be his special people? Why did God have such a plan? And that's where we started talking about in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 last week. Yeah, Jacob. Certainly. I mean, that was certainly what we were talking about. The reason why God gave them the word, and we touched on this last week in verse 1 and 2 here of chapter 3, was they were entrusted with that. They were entrusted with the oracles of God. And we talked about what that meant. They had a purpose in getting that, and that was to be that teacher to the rest of the world around them, to the Gentiles around them.
Jesus was born of Jews,
Of that lineage, yep.
his human side,
Yeah,
so I guess that has something to do with it.
certainly. Yeah, that was all part of God's plan, right? That would be through this lineage, through David. So we talked last week again. So I'm just going to read Romans chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 again here. Then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. And we were hitting that at the end of last week's lesson. So what did entrust mean? We talked about that. To entrust is to assign a person a particular responsibility. The thing that you have been given isn't actually for you. It's for the person to whom you're supposed to deliver it. And that was one of that idea of what entrust meant. Entrust wasn't just that you got something. You're supposed to take care of something. You're supposed to be responsible for something because it had another purpose associated with it. And you were supposed to make sure that that purpose was fulfilled, that that purpose was accomplished there. And this is the idea behind what Paul is talking about here. The advantage is that the Jews were entrusted with God's message for the world, not just for themselves. And we talked about this over and over again in chapter 2. Chapter 2 has condemned them for not being the lights in the world and guides to the blind. They were entrusted with the divine message that was to be delivered to the world. And the interesting choice there, the oracles of God. What was an oracle in that society at that time? How did they view oracles, especially like the pagan world?
Well, the written law, I guess you can say, it wasn't even a law.
No.
Oracles doesn't necessarily mean law, does it?
Yeah, it was usually like someone who would speak on behalf of the god, right? Like so, they would have this notion of all these gods they were worshiping. Of course, those gods weren't talking to them, and
They're just written down.
someone might decide, well, I'm going to go to war with this group over here. Is it the right time? Is it the right? Will this god bless me if I go to war? Right? So they would go speak to the oracle, go find out what is their god's interpretation of what they should do, and that person would supposed to deliver that message back to them as to what was going on. That's how the pagans kind of worship their gods. One went in and was entrusted with the oracle from the god, and the messenger told the people what the oracle was, like what the message was from that god. Bob.
I was thinking, have we ever considered the idea that God had to choose someone?
God had to choose someone.
Some group, whatever group you would pick, they probably would have felt as miserable as the Jews.
Yeah, I mean,
Our appeal was to bring man back to God.
yeah, certainly it's all part of God's plan, right? God did it this way because that was the way to do it. That was the way that he felt the way to be done. But it does raise an important point, and that we're going to hit on as we go through this. If God used the Jews to show his righteousness, to show his greatness, that he's just, then is it fair to punish them for what they've done, right? Is it fair to punish them for turning their back on him? And that's kind of the open question that's being touched on here. And we're gonna get that as we get into the next section. So kind of hold that in your thought for now. But back to this notion of the oracles and the message. The words of God also taught them about God's salvation. They had promises of God that he would save Israel through the Messiah. But rather than teach the world, they kept the message to themselves, and they did not deliver that message. So again, back to what was the value of having the oracles of God? They knew this plan. They knew about the Messiah. They knew all the stuff that was recorded in the Old Testament and what the prophets had spoken about and all these things that were going to happen. They knew about it, and yet they kept it to themselves. They didn't deliver that message to those around them. Any other comments on that part before we move on? Yes, Jacob.
I think it might be fair to say that they went beyond not only not delivering the message properly to those around them, they didn't even express it properly to those around them through their actions.
Yeah.
By the time of Jesus.
Yeah, and that was what Tracy was mentioning before about being hypocritical, right? Their actions proved exactly the opposite. They were supposed to teach the Gentiles that were around about having this right attitude, doing the right things, and instead they were guilty of those things. So how can you teach the Jews or teach the Gentiles not to be adulterous when you yourself are adulterous? That kind of problem. So it was very much a hypocritical thing. Yeah.
Of course, we don't have that problem today.
course, that's very much alive and true today. Let's pick up back in Romans chapter 3, and I want to read the rest of this first section here to verse 8. So Romans 3, verses 3 through 8, and then we'll kind of get into more of the meat of the question for today. So Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. All right, so what do you think is going on here in this passage?
Paul does one of his asides where he gets away from his main point
Yeah.
that he's making and he goes into the side point.
True? Which is one reason why it's been hard for us to kind of
Yes.
make traction. But yes, these are all important side points that he's making there. To start with, who are the unfaithful here that he's talking about in verse 3?
Those who had the law but didn't keep it.
Okay, those who had the law but didn't keep it. The Jews specifically, right? Israel not living up to their responsibility. They had the very oracles of God, but what we just talked about in chapter 2, they weren't being that light to those around them. They weren't living up to that responsibility. Verses 3 through 4 here. Based on Paul's charges in chapter 2, the next question is about unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel. So Israel was to be a guide to the blind, but they were not. Israel was to be the light to the nations, but was not. Israel was to be a teacher of righteousness, but they needed to be taught themselves. Israel, rather than being a mechanism to heal nations, instead they need healing themselves. Rather than bringing people to God, Israel has shown themselves to be in need of a physician. Since Israel broke the covenant and was unfaithful, will this nullify God's faithfulness to the covenant? And again, that's an important question. So if the covenant is broken because Israel broke it, does that mean that God's still going to hold up his side of the bargain? That God's still going to hold up the covenant? Like if the covenant's broken because of what Israel did, does that mean it's over? Tracy?
The Bible that my mom left me was the King James Version, and I can't lie, it prevented me from learning and trying to. So I use multiple versions, and when I reread it from the NIV version, it made more sense to me that I want to interpret it from verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? So I set in my mind, not at all, Paul says. Let God be true and every human be a liar. That's still true, as is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Okay, so verse 5, but if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath upon us? I think of it like being a parent. Is God our Father? Absolutely. He's giving out these rules, and just because some of his children don't follow it, doesn't mean what our Father, our parents say is completely null and void.
Yeah.
We're wrong to just completely dismiss our parents and what they say and how they teach us only because some of our brothers and sisters aren't doing
Okay.
the thing. And then the thing that made me giggle, verse 8 from the King James, and not rather as we be slanderously reported and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil, that good may come. So I think that it made me think of, so we should be doing bad stuff so that the good stuff can come around.
Yeah.
That's what made me think of it.
Well, that's part of the charge there, right? It's if by all this unrighteousness and evil, it just shows God is so righteous and so great that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise, is that an excuse to do more evil so that God could appear more righteous? And that's one of the charges that's being brought to you. We're going to get to that before we close out this section. But back to the original question, again, and I think you touched on it, but what is the idea of a covenant? What is a covenant? A pact or promise? Yeah, like today we would think of it as like contract law, right? You have a contract between two parties, especially in the business world. Party A agrees to do something, party B, they both get into an agreement together. There's a contract that covers it. What happens if one side breaks that contract? It's usually null and void, right? Usually there's an excuse that, well, this contract doesn't matter anymore because they can't keep the contract. And that's one of the natural questions that we would have, or at least enters my mind. If this contract exists between God and his people don't keep up the bargain and they can't honor that contract, what's God's obligation to continue forward with that contract, right? So kind of our natural inclination might be that, well, that just means that we're kind of in trouble, right? We're going to have a problem because we know we're going to be judged. God has this contract with us, but yet we've failed to live up to it. So what's God going to do? That's the question. So the natural answer would be that we broke the contract, so God does not have to keep his end of the covenant. Those that were Jews, they broke the contract. God doesn't have to keep up his end of it. But that's not the answer. And what Tracy touched on there in verse 4, even though Israel has been unfaithful, God is still going to be faithful. God is still going to keep his word because God is righteous and God is just. And the phrase used there, is really interesting. Even though the whole world, everyone on the earth was a liar, right? Even though everyone on earth was a liar, God's still going to be truthful. He's still going to be just.
Two things. One thing that is often in contracts that you left out is not only the responsibilities of each party,
Yeah.
but also the penalties.
True. Yeah.
And so when is God not going to be faithful? No, he's going to enforce those penalties.
Okay. That's a good way to put it. Okay. Yeah, so Paul's answer there, by no means, absolutely not. Verse 4, even if the whole world was full of liars, God is going to remain true and keep his word. He's going to make sure that it happens.
That's what it's like. Today we say, well, if everybody did this, would you do it?
Right.
The picture he's showing, if everybody says this, does that make God a liar?
Yeah.
No, God's still the truth.
Right.
So even if everybody agrees, God's still going to do what he said he was going to do.
Right.
We all say God shouldn't punish everybody because he's love, doesn't change God.
Very true, right? It doesn't alter that covenant, that contract. Yeah, absolutely. God is going to be righteous no matter what. God is going to be faithful to his promise no matter what. And God is going to be true to his word no matter what. Even if the whole world, again, were liars, God is still going to keep his word. Israel's unfaithfulness does not nullify God's faithfulness, is another way to say it. Verse 3, Tracy, since you mentioned the NIV, I know the NIV uses, I don't have a copy of the NIV with me, but in my electronic version here, but I know the NIV translates some sections as it's more about like a personal faith that's being talked about. So I'm not sure what the NIV says for verse 3, but the point I want to make out to you that it's not talking about a personal faith here. It's the nation's faithfulness to the commission given by God. Again, it's Israel's faithfulness. It's our faithfulness as a whole. God keeps his word, and he is faithful to his promise. Okay, that's the main point to take away there. All right, so God keeps his word, he's faithful to his promise. So one important point now is to take a moment to stop and think about what that actually means. Right? What does it mean that God's faithful to his promise? We are in a covenant with God through Jesus. We are violators of this glorious covenant. Right? We're all worthy of death on our own, as we've talked about before. As we studied in chapter 2, we are faced with a problem of honoring God. We are supposed to be what? We're supposed to be lights to the world, guides to the blind, teachers to the nations, just like we were talking about the Jewish nation. But our actions don't always honor and glorify God, but cause God dishonor because of the things that we do, that we choose to do as people. We still sin even though we have been brought into the covenant relationship with God. But do our actions as Christians today, do our actions cause God to no longer be faithful to the covenant? We talked about the Jewish nation. What about us today? We know about the covenant made through Christ, right? Do our actions cause God to be unfaithful? No, right? And that's this whole point that's being made here. We want to again, let that sink in because it means something to us today. We get all these questions in our head when we sin concerning God's faithfulness. Will God still forgive me of my sins even though I made some terrible mistake? And how often do you see people in society around you that you're trying to spread the gospel to or teach or help, and you see they're in a dire strait or they have a problem, and you know you could help them, and you're trying to share that good news with them, and they say, well, no, I'm too far gone, right? God, I've sinned so much in my life. God's never going to forgive me for all that, right? Like that's the attitude that some people want to have. Or even just our own selves. We can take personally that if we have some sin that's troubling us greatly and that we can't get over and that we keep running back to, right? Instead, the message here that I want us to take is that we should have some security in God's promise, right? Will God be faithful? Will he be faithful to the covenant? And the answer is yes. Will God still forgive me even though I've made terrible mistakes? The answer, yes. God keeps his covenant. Will God still love me when I make mistakes? Answer, yes. God is faithful. God is always faithful. We have great security in this. It does not matter what everyone else in the world does, or as Daryl said, what everyone else says about God. The world can be full of liars and faithless people, but God will keep his word. God keeps his promises. How great is that to have, to rely on, that God keeps his promises, that that's the God that we serve. What a great source of confidence and encouragement to know that God keeps his promises. God is faithful even though we are unfaithful to the covenant. God's love never stops. His faithfulness never stops. It does not matter what we have done. God will always, always, always take us back. But what's that conditioned on again? We talked about in chapter 1 and 2 about having that seeking heart, right? And coming back to God. Not having that, we talked about the two minds, right? Having the unfit mind and the fit mind. We have to have the fit mind and the seeking heart. We can't have the unfit mind. God is not relying on us. God is the one who is faithful and the one who can save. God is the one whose faith we can rely on. And to validate that further, Romans chapter 3, verse 4, where does that quote come from that he mentions at the end of verse 4? Psalm. Which one specifically? Yeah. What's Psalm 51 about? Yeah, David asking for forgiveness. What had he just done? Yeah. Caused Uriah to die, basically. And as we talked about before, pretty terrible thing to do. Have someone that you're worried about getting caught, so you have someone murdered, right? Someone killed. That's a pretty atrocious thing to do as a human being would consider, right? Like, that's definitely sin. No doubt about that. But yet, this is the quote here. David's prayer here that is being referenced as a good example. David is saying that there is no doubt about the righteousness of God's verdict. God's words are always true, even if all human words prove false. And again, this was a grave sin that David committed here that's being referenced. And in that psalm there, it asks for God to create in David a clean heart and a right spirit. David in his sin declares that God is right to judge his actions. God is right and we are in the wrong. Again, whenever we've committed sin, God is right to be the judge. The quotation from Psalm 51 reminds us of our sinfulness, that God is right to judge us in wrath, but despite our sinfulness remains faithful to the covenant and offers forgiveness. So again, that full circle of forgiveness. Any other thoughts on that, Mark?
2 Timothy 2 and 13, Paul says, if we remain faithless, he remains faithful.
Yeah.
In other words, God cannot lie. It's impossible for him to lie. So he's going to keep his promise.
All right. Yep. Very good. Yes.
A small, I don't know, it's a tangent, not a tangent, but something I think of considering with Psalm 51. When I talk to people who think that they are unworthy of God, I've been the worst person. There's no way God could possibly love me and forgive me for what I did. And David literally pushed his friend into the front of a car,
Yeah.
to make it 2023. And as he confessed and begged for forgiveness, and God forgave him. So let us think about the things that we have done. And that is something that I share with my friends who they feel that they're unworthy. And I'm like,
Yeah.
It's a verse that I use to let them know that it's very possible to ask God for that forgiveness and then have,
Hmm.
you do have, unfortunately, the consequences to your actions,
Yeah.
but thank goodness still.
The world we live in today is definitely full of some horrible people, right? And I bet if we looked, we could find someone that has done something worse than that person that you're talking about, right? Yeah.
Go off of Tracy's comment, even if we do the worst thing, which was the worst thing that could have been done was to kill Christ, which we
Yeah.
constantly through our sins, God is still willing to forgive us. So even through our evil actions, God sees past that. He sees the repentant heart, and it will change. If we see our error, if we're made known of our error, and then God sees that forgiveness that we're trying to ask for Him, He will forgive us. He's constant. He's built this foundation
Yep.
of consistency, where we may be wishy-washy, we may be liars, we may be murderers. God's always going to have that foundation that we can go back to.
Yeah, again, that promise doesn't, again, it's about God and God's consistency and God's promise. It doesn't depend on our behavior as long as we're seeking that relationship with God. We're seeking that forgiveness. Oh, yeah. Paul, it's a great example. What was Paul guilty of doing? He was having Christians murdered, right? Trying to thwart God's will, thwart God's purpose. And yet, God forgave him and made something great out of him, made him so critical. Bob?
Now, notice you always keep meaning that word about the seeking heart. You have to realize that seeking heart also involves repentance.
Absolutely.
Except that, bottom line is, except you repent, you shall die.
And again, the seeking heart is joined and connected with that fit mind, and that fit mind and that seeking heart is going to cause us to have obedience, right? It's going to cause us to be doers of the word, 100%. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, even Paul said the things that I don't want to do, I do. So, it's in man's nature to sin, whether it's not caused by anything, but if we're not taught from a young age, right from wrong, and we get old, then it makes it much harder. Believe me, much harder. And most families, including mine, they don't even, never read the Bible. They just throw it on the shelf.
And that's why it's so important, again, to have that seeking heart, because that trains our mind, right? We can't get away with having that unfit mind, because as we talked about in chapter 1, that unfit mind leads us to all kinds of depravity, and we'll justify it. We'll find a way to say to ourselves, oh, that must be okay, and it's not. And that's why we have to live in the Word. We have to have that seeking heart. We have to try to grow our relationship closer to God, so that when those challenges come our way, our mind is fit, it's set straight, and we can tackle those more carefully. That's a very good point.
Says that God provides to have escape.
Absolutely.
We have to go through it.
Absolutely.
He's not pushing us as a robot. We have a choice.
Absolutely. Yep. Very good. Okay. So verses 5 through 8 here in this passage. Point there, just because God uses Israel's unrighteousness to show his own faithfulness does not mean that they are exempt from judgment. And that was the original question we'd asked, remember? Just because God used the unfaithfulness of Israel to reveal how truly faithful he is, that does not make God unfair or somehow unjust when he still judges the people for their unfaithfulness. Back to the actions, right? And the hearts that they have. To judge the world fairly, God must judge everyone. God cannot only judge the Gentiles, he must also judge the Jews, even though their unfaithfulness revealed God's faithfulness. Further, just because Israel possessed the promises of nations' deliverance does not exempt them from judgment. Again, God must judge everyone. And, often we'll hear the doctrine or taught that, like, you just have to be saved, and once you're saved, you're always saved, and you don't have to worry about anything anymore. But it's all about that transformation of who we are as an individual and whether we put our minds in that right state. Just because we've been saved doesn't mean that we'll never turn our back on God or never be guilty of sin again. In fact, we know that we'll all fall short in one way or the other.
There's a lot of people of other faiths that believe that you can't fall from grace, and my father-in-law was one, and he used that scripture, no man can pluck another man from the hand of God, or whatever, I can't quote it exactly. And my husband told him, said, no, that's right, you pluck yourself away from the
Yeah.
hand of God.
And again, the nation of Israel, they certainly didn't get pulled away from God. They abandoned God in their own decision, right?
That was their choice.
And the same thing applies to us today. Like you said, no one's going to tear us away from God if we're having that right heart again. We're seeking after God, but we could certainly corrupt our own minds and walk our own selves away from God, and that happens all the time. Very good. Okay, continuing on here, verse 5 through 8. Just because we are people of God who have come to Jesus for the forgiveness of sins does not negate that judgment must still come to all people. God is not partial, everyone must be judged. God cannot only judge the lost, he must also judge his own people. So again, emphasizing that point. If we are not seeking the Lord and do not have a heart that has been transformed for the Lord, we thought about that idea of circumcision from chapter 2 again, right? If we don't have that transformed heart, then we're going to experience God's wrath. We're going to be subject to that judgment. Verses 7 through 8. 7 through 8 is a little bit less clear, at least I guess in my mind, what's being asked here or what's being talked about. But it seems that there were some people that were making some accusations against Paul and the apostles, that he's addressing some response here that would have been raised. If Israel's falsehood means that God's truthfulness shines out all the more brightly, why should God object to that, right? Back to the idea, if sin unveils the righteousness of God, why don't we just sin more? Because then God will be all that much more, look all that much better. And there's a notion there that, let's see, why should we be condemned as Gentile sinners, as stated in Romans 2:27? And we're going to talk about that more in Romans chapter 6 when we get there. But for right now, Paul just ends it with that remark at the end of the verse there, saying that their condemnation is deserved for people who think that way. And again, it seems like the idea is that some were saying that the message of grace was a message of how sin brought the good and faithfulness of God out, like somehow changed God or made God better or more actful or caused him to do something. And that's not the right mindset. Again, that's the depraved way of thinking, the unfit mind way of thinking. Back to us justifying ourselves, right? Well, I have to sin because then that gives God an ability to bless me or forgive me, right? That's not the right way to think about it. That's the depraved way of thinking about it. Instead, God was righteous because that's his nature. God is just because that's his nature. And he set up that pathway for us. Any other thoughts on this section before we move on? Yeah.
Well, the Jews have always said they were the promised people, and still
Yeah.
today they say they're the promised people, even with the conflicts that are happening.
Yep.
But we know after AD 70 that God is not in that same covenant that he made with them.
Yeah, I mean,
They completely went away from him, and they denied Christ, say he was a prophet only, then he's the only way to heaven. How are you going to make it?
yeah.
So I can see why God's like, well, I tried for thousands some years to get you straight. It's sad, but they did. They left him over and over.
Yeah, we talk often about the long-suffering nature of God, right? His patience with us. Be so thankful that he is so patient with us, but eventually that his justice must be fulfilled. And that, of course, we talked about it, AD 70 in the destruction of Jerusalem. That was the judgment that had to pass. The temple was destroyed. There's no longer a place for Jews there to go worship. A lot of their lineage and records were even destroyed, right? So people trying to trace back their lineage to Abraham and stuff, like all those records are even gone. Okay. So to conclude this section, there's no one righteous, no one is faithful, no one has kept their end of the covenant. We are all under the power of sin, and we need to hear the truth that we are in sin and we are all doomed. Like that's the takeaway, on our own accord. God has no reason to have kept his word with us because we've broken the covenant. We are under sin, and God has no, quote-unquote, legal obligation to stay with us. But just because we're unfaithful, just because Israel was unfaithful, just because we as Christians today are unfaithful, that does not nullify the faithfulness of God. God remains faithful. God will keep his word, and will keep his covenant faithful towards us. Again, what a blessing it is from God that even though all the ways that we fail him, God is still there for us. Yeah.
I guess this is something I should already understand, but through Christ, when we obey the gospel, we become righteous.
Yeah. Yes.
So that even if or when we sin,
I think when you said the word repent there, right, that's a big part of it. Because again, it's that heart. And that's what we've been talking about all along is that
We could not be righteous without Christ, period.
100%, yeah.
So if we're in Christ, then we were righteous.
And that's the point again of this judgment. The judgment due to all of us, Jews, Gentiles, Christians today, is death. But because of Christ, right? But because of Christ, we have that covering of it, right? We're part of God's family. And the forgiveness is there. And it's not because we've done something to earn it, right? It's not just because we are so good or so better compared to someone else. Like, that's the game we want to play. Well, I may not be as bad as these people. I'm at least, no. We're all worthy of death except for Christ. And it's only because of that. And because we have that seeking heart, we choose to obey God. We want to grow closer to God. We want to get our minds fit and right. And we want to strive for that relationship. That's what gives us that path of salvation. And again, through Christ. Is there another comment over here? Yeah.
I believe in verse 7 that Paul's really trying to say that he remained true in spite of his failures. But his failures were great for us. I mean, he wrote the most books. He's done so many things. It's just, one time we were looking for a preacher. Well, we weren't, but we asked like we were. And then we brought up all his qualifications, and nobody would vote for him to be the preacher. Wasn't married, he was in jail, all this stuff, and everybody was like, nope, and then they said, oh, well, it's the Apostle Paul we're talking about. Everybody's like, what?
It's interesting, yeah.
Preacher.
It's very interesting, yeah. No, I mean, Paul is such a great example, again, because he was very evil, but he had that heart, again, that was seeking, and thankful to the Lord in his conversion that showed him the way was wrong, but yeah, 100%. Any other comments before we move on?
These scriptures lead us up to why we have the new law. And Hebrews 8:7 says if the first covenant had been faultless, there's been no place for the second. So all this shows where the fault lay was in the old covenant.
Very good. Okay. I think I accidentally skipped something here. All right, any other comments before we go to the next section? We'll try to at least start one more today. All right, let's go on to Romans chapter 3 and verse 9 through 20. Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave, and they use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Okay. So here Paul comes back to that original question. While the Jews did have advantages because they were given the oracles of God, those advantages did not translate into having a superior moral position over the Gentiles when it comes to salvation and judgment. Jews and Gentiles are under sin. No one is left out of this problem. More importantly, no one has a superior advantage when it comes to receiving the solution to the problem. So nobody has a better path to salvation. Paul then makes a number of quotations. What is he talking about here with all these quotations? Why is he quoting all these things?
Man is simple. Man is simple. Always been that way.
Yep. Yeah, it's not just saying the same thing again over and over again, that he's saying the same. There we go. Yeah, he's not just saying the same thing over and over again, trying to say it repetitively. But there's two important observations to make here. First, these quotations from Jewish writers, and this is from David and Isaiah, about the people living in Israel. They're writing about other Jews in this case. So these traits that are listed here are not just descriptions of Gentiles, they're descriptions of other Jews that were alive at various times, right? When these words were penned, they were not written about Gentiles. Sorry about that. Yeah, the battery too. I think we're rolling to the end anyways. I just changed these last week. So anyways, here, he's listing these things here, these traits that different people have, and to Zach's point, everybody's evil. That's the key takeaway. Is that that's been true of people for all time. All right, there we go. That's something. These traits have been true of people for all time. The Jews are just as sinful as the Gentiles were, even though they possessed the law of Moses. Again, this idea that having this extra knowledge should have kept them in a better state, but that's not the result. Excuse me. My voice giving out.
I was gonna say, it's good you mentioned that, because look up to verse 23. I mean, that says it all have sin come for us.
Yep. Absolutely. So the charge is being made here, verse 12, going astray. Verse 13 through 14, wicked speech. Verse 15 through 17, violent behavior. Paul is not just saying that no one is righteous in a number of different ways, but rather giving a indictment against who the Jews are. That, again, they're not any better than the Gentiles. That's the point. We're all deserving of death. So then back to the conclusion I was trying to make before, again, about no one being righteous, no one being faithful. Again, that's what this passage is laying out here. None of us are good enough on our own accord. And that doesn't matter if you were a Jew at the time or a Gentile at the time, or us as a Christian today. For the things that I have done, the physical things that I have done, that doesn't make me good enough. It's because of Christ. It's because that we're part of God's family, and the blood of Christ washes that sin away from us. So that's the distinction there. That we have that cleansing power through Christ, not because of our own actions. Okay. Any other comments on that? Again, God is going to remain faithful to his word, even if every person were a liar. Verse 4, our sinfulness reveals God's goodness, loving kindness, and mercy. It does not allow us to sin because God is faithful. Rather, we are to be moved to love God because of his devotion and love towards us. The devotion and faithfulness of God is completely undeserved by us because we have broken God's covenant. So again, back to how has God treated us, how that should motivate us. Again, that should motivate us to have that greater love for God and want to grow closer to him. Then verses 19 through 20, Paul simply points out that the law of Moses did not bring salvation or justification, but a knowledge of sin. We talked about that before. What did the law highlight for people? What was the law good at doing, good at accomplishing? Showing that they were sinning, right? Like we talk about how it was to help them to be teachers and to not sin, right? To know the right things to do. But what it really did was just show that condemnation that says, well, I know I'm guilty of that. Well, I know I'm guilty of that. And here's this list of things that are in the law that people were failing and falling short of.
And all will be accountable.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All will be accountable. The Old Testament speaks, and what it shows is that all people are guilty before God. And the stopped mouth in that phrase there, in verse 19, the stopped mouth, if you see that, it's kind of a courtroom picture being had there. By placing one's hand over one's mouth indicates that there's no more to say, right? Like I can't speak to my own defense. Like I have no defense to give. It's this notion that there's nothing further to say. how could the whole world be liable to God's judgment because of a law given to the Jews? And the answer is that if the Jews, who had the privilege of being God's covenant and elect people, could not keep the law, then it follows that no one could keep the law, not even the Gentiles that were around. Again, because they had that special situation, that special oracle. No one, therefore, can present a defense. The mouth of every person is shut when it comes to a defense. Both Jews and Gentiles are guilty. And again, none of us could keep the law fully, and that would be clear. All right. Any other comments before we're done today?
There really wasn't anything wrong with the law, it's just people couldn't follow it.
Yeah. Again, it was pointing out the wrongdoing.
His first law.
Yep. Nope. I agree with you. Okay, we'll pick up in verse 21 next week, chapter 3, verse 21. I'd encourage you also to read chapter 4. At least we'll hopefully get started on chapter 4 next week. So thank you. Appreciate all your comments this morning.